Hello, good evening, good day, good morning to all of you around the world. Welcome to the 16th Maintenance Cost Conference, the MCC, as you all know. This is the episode 3. So today we're going to discuss about the COVID-19 and the impact to the industry and also to the MRO and the leasing markets. So just some information for you as we start. The session is recorded and will be available to you shortly. Your microphone is automatically muted. Please use the Q&A feature on the right side of your screen. If you have any questions, some of you have provided a few questions. For all the others, please type in your question as it comes up and address it to our speakers. We will have 3 sessions today, as you will see coming up. But remember that you can ask questions during the seminar, the webinar time. So moving on, we will have again today with us our legal antitrust counsel, Daniel Cantor, who will be screening the questions in case there is some issue with them. And we are following, as always, the competition law guidelines set up by IATA. And with this, let's move on. This is the 3rd episode. Again, I remind you of the role of the Maintenance Cost Conference to get together people, provide you with different resources, different ideas, concepts about controlling your maintenance costs as an airline, giving also a platform for various suppliers, industry stakeholders to get together, exchange views on what can be done in the maintenance area. You can find that at the links that you see on the screen on the MCTG, the Maintenance Cost Technical Group site. And at the end, you will also get a link to the IATA resources about COVID-19, and you can go straight to them. So with this, the next episode will be next, and the final will be next Wednesday, same time. And we will be discussing about the role of used serviceable material as the industry restarts. Again, register if you would like to attend to that episode. Today, the agenda will be starting with Adam Pilarski. He will be talking at Avitas for the first part of this episode, giving his always enlightenment. Hopefully, we'll hear some nice words from him. Thanks, Adam. And then we will have 3 speakers from discussing about aircraft and the engine leasing business. I will introduce them to you shortly. And we will continue and finalize with the trends in the MRO market. And moving on, our speakers today, our panelists, are Adam Pilarski. He is the Senior Vice President of Avitas. He has been a regular to the MCC. Thanks, Adam and Avitas, for your continuous participation and providing your insights into this event. It will be followed with Mark Lynch. He will be talking to us on aircraft matters related to aircraft leasing. He's the SVP of Engineering and Material Solutions for GCAS, one of the biggest lessors. Then it will be followed by Richard Hawke, Chief Technical Officer for ELFC in Ireland, one of the largest engine leasing companies. Then Timur Kalimat, Manager of Aircraft Contracts for Jazz Aviation. He has been long involved with IATA groups, and he was also a chairman of the MCTG in the past. And then we will have some questions Q&A session with for the leasing area. And then it will be followed by, first we will go with Martin Harrison, Global Managing Director for ICF. He will be giving us their forecasts about the market, the MRO market, and we will follow, he will be followed by Sonny Stern, VP of Sales and MRO Services for Delta Tech Ops, giving the perspective from a large MRO, an airline MRO, who and what they see the impact. And we will have a Q&A session after both of them regarding the MRO. And with this, let's get started. So I will pass it on to Adam. Again, thanks, Adam, for your participation. All yours.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Geraldine. Thank you, IATA. And thank you, everybody who is listening. I love coming to this conference because it's always in exotic places and nice food, nice discussions with people. Oh, wait, things slightly changed. I'm in my jail here in my home office and no real travel. So things slightly changed. Next, please. Question is, can we predict the future now in these uncertain times? Since I predict future, that's kind of important to me. And the answer is, next please, obviously yes. If you can read this funny here, what are you doing, Red? Predicting the future, just $5. Oh, tell me what tomorrow will be like. Tomorrow will be bad. What about the next day? Bad. Day after, bad. Day after, bad, 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 bad. Predictions never been easier. Next, please. Yes, right now the situation is fairly obvious. Things are not very good. Social distancing is not conducive to aviation, so that's fairly straightforward. There's no doubt about it. In the short term, there isn't flying. Is this a once-in-a-lifetime event? In my lifetime, I've been already through about 5 once-in-a-lifetime events, so you never know. Is it the end of aviation? Definitely not. We still will be here for a long time. But again, in the short term, no doubt about it, not very good. Next one. Important to understand, in addition to the virus, we have other problems. And obviously, when traffic collapses 90%, it's hard to see what I call the normal problems, the problems that we had. But virus is medical reality. I do not know enough about it, and very few people know enough about it, except, of course, the president of the US. But most other people don't really know, and we will see how many waves there will be, how strong it will be, if vaccination will work, when will they work, and so on. Next, please. I was getting away for a long time with telling people, trust me, I'm a doctor, but the real fact is, no, I'm not the right kind of doctor. I'm just a PhD. So I cannot tell you about the virus, but I can tell you about the other things. Next, please. Let's call it normal problems. We are in a major economic recession, no doubt about it. And some of us, like yours truly, have been predicting a major economic recession for a long time. I was off by maybe half a year in my predictions. We also are experiencing an extended bubble, which had to burst. If you remember last time I spoke, I had the Lego song, everything is awesome, and I was saying it has to burst. I was repeating it so many times that people in the industry started calling me Bubble Boy. So important to understand, even if we did not have the virus, we still would face the economic recession and the fact that there are too many planes for aviation. So adjustment needed to happen, it happened. Next, please. Next, please. Another funny, here are two kids. I'm thinking well beyond the school reopening issue. I'm concerned about how the situation might impact the ability of Santa to travel internationally, which means longer term. I have bad news for you guys. If your kids, even if your kids were really good, Santa may not be able to bring them presents this year because of travel restrictions. But we do know that aviation will change, and it's important to try to understand how it will change and think about your own business, how you can do things better, and how can you adapt. And hopefully all of you will be successful and your organizations will be successful. Next, please. In March, I started doing our forecasts, and the forecasts were that the economy this year will drop over 8%. This is world economy, which is a major recession. And my forecast was that traffic will drop about 63% compared to 2019. And if you believe my forecasts, and when I started it in April, people were not as upbeat, or were more upbeat. They didn't accept my pessimistic views. Only by 2003, 2004, here, you know, we'll get back to 2019 levels. And if you look at the chart, it's parallel. So we recover from the downturn, but we never get back to the previous levels. That traffic is lost. Next, please. Next, please. You had the first episode, Brian Pierce, your chief economist, who I like a lot and value his opinions. And you heard his opinion, or your IATA's opinions. Interesting to me is, if you look at the forecasts, our forecasts were drop of 60, close to 63%, done in April. And initially, IATA was getting more and more, started with -11, -38, and eventually you caught up with my pessimism. Oh, thank you, Brian, for confirming in much better English. Brian sounds much more professional than I do, and is a banker and has a great English accent. So you can believe these numbers now that IATA confirms what we have. Go on. Next. And this was your, in the first episode, you had a poll here. And if you can see, people that believed it will take at least 3 years to get back to 2019. In June, there were only 4% of IATA members, and now they are over 24, and it hopefully, or not hopefully, it should grow, because there's no way we are coming back quickly. Next. Fairly straightforward. If traffic doesn't return, costs are higher, less business traffic, meaning costs go up, revenue doesn't go up as much, profitability will not be good. Thank you. Next. Next, please. What will you, how many additional planes do we need? Well, that's very difficult to guess. But if it takes us 4 or 5 years to get back to 2019 level, and we already have the planes for 2019 level, it means there will be less demand for new planes. So our forecast pre-COVID and post-COVID have difference of about 5,000 planes. There will be 5,000 planes less needed to carry the traffic. Next, please. It takes us time as humans to acknowledge that things are not good. And I'm sorry to say, trust me, things, especially after winter, will be tougher. There will be more layoffs coming, both at airlines, at OEMs, and there's no way around it. It would be worse if you didn't have the governments, and it's interesting, you have to think how to cooperate with governments. Reality will change. There are new players, but governments manage to, around the world, manage to make the fall not as dramatic. Next, please. So, related to the lessors and MROs, who and airlines, who will do worse, airlines or lessors? And to me, that's interesting, but I was yesterday all day with Wall Street people, and next, please. Wall Street analysts believe that lessors will do better. If there are too many planes, airlines don't need as many planes, who will suffer, airlines or the financial owners of the aircraft? And Wall Street believes that lessors will do better because they have deeper pockets, they don't have tens of thousands of employees, they don't have to burn fuel, they don't have to do a lot of short-term expenses. And Wall Street also buys into the idea of, if you have problems in India, you move the planes to Brazil. You can move the assets. I am not confident that this is the case. Next, please. Airlines have government support. Financial institutions, except maybe some Middle East and some in China, don't have government support. Governments don't want to support an outfit that has 100 highly paid executives. They want to support an airline that has tens of thousands of employees, that brings tourists to the country. Additionally, to me, what can lessors do if you airline don't pay? When I talk to lessors, their view is, look, they have to pay because they signed the contract. Yeah, good luck. And if they don't, what will you do? Repossess the plane? Where will you then put it? Next, please. So now the question is, there will be less planes, which will be retired or parked. And there's a slew of technical reasons, and you guys at this conference are the experts. And hopefully, and I heard that first episode already some talk about which planes do you park, which do you store, and so on. But another element is value of planes. And we, Avitas, believe we are the experts on this. And how do you assign values when nobody trades in planes? And we have our methodologies, developed a special edition blue book, and I'll show you a summary of different planes and different vintages. Next, please. So here you can look at it at your convenience. Different planes will be losing at different percentages. And of course, if we say narrow body out of production, it also depends on the particular vintage of a given plane. Next, please. Next, please. Okay, so far I sounded fairly negative. So I was thinking about some positives, and chocolates are still good. That's wonderful. As a matter of fact, I'm sitting here in my jail and I have a supply of various chocolates. So life is not as bad as could be. Aviation is still wonderful and still has a great future. And the positive is humankind works better in hard times. So hard times inspire human ingenuity, and we can expect new products, new firms, new businesses, new processes. Airbus already started talking about a new family of aircraft. All of this hopefully will, in few years, right now, no doubt, no, it's not good. In a few years, things will be much better and we'll have a glorious future. Next, please. Next, please. And I want to add with a positive, here are some chocolates for you. I think you can ask me questions. I don't know how this will be done. If not, you have my email and you can send me love notes on that. Thank you very much for your attention. Chris, I'm done. I was within my time. Thank you.
Yes, you are within your time, Adam. Thank you so much. There are a few questions. Let's see, we have a few minutes here for Q&A. I was wondering, what is your view with respect to the MAX and the Boeing aircraft? Is that now there are a few hundreds of them parked with airlines? Boeing is going to deliver, or they're parked on the Boeing fields. There are another about 1,000 even aircraft that are waiting to fly. So what will happen to those? How do you see this aircraft coming into this mess, let's say, with respect to aircraft storage and parking aircraft? Any views on that, Adam?
Yes, I mean, as I was saying, without the virus, we had a bubble. We had too many planes. Luckily, we, the industry, are incompetent, so we managed to screw things up and park another 1,000 planes, which lessened the severity of the bubble bursting. But MAX is coming back. It may not be called MAX. Steve Hazy is now pushing to change its name or to de-emphasize the MAX thing, but yes, the plane will be safe, will come back, and will fly. On the other hand, both Airbus and Boeing don't want to spend too much effort to improve these planes. So I think the proper strategy for manufacturers is continue the same planes that you have and then go into revolutionary new planes. And this is what Airbus is talking about now with the hydroplanes. So it will, nobody demands the MAXes immediately back, and nobody demands for the planes to be called MAX. But I think all these planes, the 1,000 planes you mentioned, will come back in due time. They may be called something different, and they will serve well, and they will have no problems.
Thank you, Adam. One other question is about the conversion from a passenger aircraft to a freighter aircraft. In order to do that, and we have seen an uptick in the market about these conversions, do you think it's worth it for someone who has one of the older vintage type of aircraft to still invest into them and make that upgrade and put it into you know, an MRO? It will take a few months to be modified, to be converted, and then flying again. Is that time window enough for someone to cover up the investment to get value back from this? What's your opinion on that?
Yeah, and obviously each business decision has to be done separately, what works for you, but it's a temporary phenomenon. If you notice our forecast of values of aircraft, freighters were the only ones that didn't have deterioration in value. And it's not actually that freight went up, but because less people are flying, you have less belly capacity. So there's less freight being carried, but even less freight capacity. So those who had them were doing well. And it's a temporary thing, and you have to do your own business plans. But right now, if you are there, you were lucky. If you want to plan to have a conversion in a few years and hope that these numbers will carry for a longer time, that's a more risky endeavor.
Thank you,
Chris?
Adam. Yes, one other question from the audience is the accumulated losses seem that exceed the profits in history for aviation. Do we think that, do we expect that governments will start owning airlines? As you mentioned, many jobs are related to tourism, and that depends on aviation. What do you think about the future and how the governments will fare about airline ownership?
Do you have 3 hours now where I go into politics and so on? Notice that this comes together with political changes in the world and nationalistic changes in the world. But definitely in Europe, especially, governments are assuming a bigger role. And I don't think they want to continue. I think they want to get out of it. In the US, you have the government offered money to airlines, and a number of airlines said, no, we can get better terms. We don't have to give up our independence by going to capital markets. So same with Boeing. Boeing did not want to get too much money from the government to save jobs because it's not clear cut that you're losing your independence. And we will see. In the short term, it's a very positive thing that we have governments that are willing to basically print more money and help a very difficult situation. And it's a reality that will stay with us for a few years. Again, in Europe, it means that governments will be telling airlines what kind of planes to fly in terms of environment. We'll see where it goes. Very interesting developments.
Yeah, thank you, Adam. And since we have our aircraft and engine lessors coming up, do you gave us some high-level figures about the values of aircraft. Any comments with respect to the engines as assets? How do you see the value of those? Are they going to drop as much, and related, of course, to the aircraft that you shown there? What is your opinion with respect to aircraft versus engines?
Again, our valuation people are now putting together new values, and yes, they will be affected. With engines, it's more complicated because there are different phases in their lives. And when I mentioned lessors right now will have problems, I think engine lessors will come out of it sooner than regular airplane lessors. And you have some lessors talk about it now. But definitely engines will be affected, but you have to look deeper into it. Which kind of planes will stay around? What engines do they have, and so on.
Thank you, Adam. And
let the others talk.
one last question for you. Do you expect that the business travel will come back to the pre-COVID levels? What is your opinion on this?
I mean, right now in the US, because we are a society that is governed by lawsuits, there's very little business travel. You don't want to send your employees on a business trip. They become sick and sue you. So most businesses do not want people to travel, but things will be changing. And I think the old conferences that we had and all business travel will come back in a few years, but not to the same degree. And that's tremendously negative, because these are the people that make the most money for airlines.
Okay, I think your time is up, Adam.
Thank you so very much, everybody.
You cannot hear the big round of applause from the crowd, but I can assure you that it was a really very exciting and very interesting presentation. And thanks again for your insightful thinking and your presentation. So with this, we move on to our next speaker, Mark Lynch from GCAS. So Mark, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Chris, thank you very much, and thank you, Adam, for your insight into where the industry is likely to go. I also appreciate the number of people who've dialed in to listen to this conversation. So look, just to introduce myself, people probably know who GCAS is. We're an aircraft, engine, and through Milestone Aviation, helicopter lessor too. We also have a cargo leasing division, and through GCAS Material we have a parts recovery and distribution operation. So we cover a lot of ground within our organization. Next slide. So look, I think we all know the current scenario. Adam has laid it out pretty clearly there. IATA predicts that we're facing a longer multi-year recovery. But I do think that it is worth stressing that the one thing to recognize is that the situation isn't permanent. Travel will return. And personally, I'm kind of with Netflix, Reed Hastings. People need to get out of their bedrooms. They need to interact, to travel, to be fully creative and productive. My sense is that when the ability to travel comes back, people will get back to it. Cargo was mentioned as a bright spot. Certainly as a company, we believe it will continue to be so. We have a fleet of 90 freighters at the moment, and with IAI this year, we've launched the 777-300 ER freighter, which will ultimately be a replacement for all the 747 freighters that are traveling the world at the moment. Next slide. So look, when it comes to predicting, rather than show you what I predict now, it's probably more interesting to show you what I predicted 6 months ago, or sorry, 9 months ago. This was back in November 2019 when I was presenting at an IATA safety conference. And you can see from this slide that every 15 years, aviation effectively doubles, traffic doubles. And my question at that time was, how was, with the increase in leasing, how would aviation authorities cope with, by 2030, up to 8,000 aircraft transitions per year? So, in hindsight, clearly the path between 2015 and 2030, is certainly going to be different. I was interested to see, the fact that Adam believes there'll be a permanent decline at the end of it. I don't know. I'd like to see a 2030 where we actually end up in the end. If you look at September 2001 and the financial crisis and whatnot, I know they were literally blips compared to what we face at the moment. But aviation recovered. They were the end of the world too. Once in a lifetime events, and ultimately we got through them. Next slide. So look, effectively, except for people who are flying pure cargo at the moment, this is a crisis and a genuine crisis for the entire industry. But in my mind, it doesn't change, what we need to do. But I think it is ultimately a good impetus in doing the things we already know we need to do. And just before we knew there was going to be a recession at some stage, we had to be more efficient. So when the crisis comes, I think there's no better opportunity than to be more efficient and to implement things. And a crisis, always gives you the opportunity to do that. So next slide. So look, I think one area where a lot of work has already been done in respect of efficiency gains is on aircraft records. The AWG, the Aviation Working Group, which is a group of lessors, financiers, and the OEMs, together with IATA, have agreed on a standardized record checklist, and that's available on the IATA guidance material, IATA guidance material. IATA has stepped in last year, and they've clarified what the regulatory requirements are in respect of records. The use of the, frankly, stupid non-incident statement has been to a large extent replaced by an incident clearance statement. And what's also important is that now we have the ability, everyone stores records electronically now, but since the introduction of Spec 2500, we now have the ability to transfer electronic records, and that is a major change for us. And what we actually do at the moment, we are now happy as a lessor to offer aircraft with no paper records. So we'll deliver an aircraft with pure electronic records, and similarly, we'll take an aircraft back with the exact same. So look, another interesting point is that what we'd started to do last year has now kind of rapidly come to fruition. We now carry out almost all of our aircraft records reviews remotely. We do an initial review through a centralized record review section. And then the detail or problems that come up, we can then address, at the on-site level. But what that does is already ensure that there's no need for weeks to be spent on site reviewing paper, and clearly that eliminates a lot of T&L, and also gets around, the quarantine issues, which has been the real issue. Another thing that's interesting that's happened when it comes to the delivery of new aircraft. We've now delivered a new aircraft to a customer, with the customer without being physically present at the handover of the aircraft. The customer did a streaming cabin walkthrough and also, carried out drone inspections of the aircraft external structure. So we were able to, physically deliver an aircraft and look at new ways of doing it, and that wouldn't have happened without the crisis and the customer being physically unable to travel to where the aircraft actually was. We've also, been working very closely with aviation authorities, and in almost all cases in the last 6 months, where an aviation authority wants to do an inspection of an aircraft but can't physically do it, we've been able to work out a compromise. And in fact, one interesting fact is, since February this year, when the crisis really kicked in, we have converted and delivered to the US 8 freighter aircraft that were converted in China and ultimately delivered to a US customer. And we did pretty much all the management of those projects remotely. In fact, the only kind of touch points we had with the aircraft was actually flying the aircraft from China to the US. So I guess these are examples of where, exactly as Adam said, where ingenuity and people looking at problems and saying, well, how do we get over them? And this crisis allows a lot of kind of sacred taboos to be questioned and to be addressed. And I would hope that these efficiency gains would be sustained in the long term. Now, some clearly will revert back where they don't make sense. We're just having to do things for expediency's sake. But I think a lot of the stuff we're doing now will stand to us in the future. Next slide. Look, cash conservation, I think everyone knows about it, and I don't think there's anything on this slide that's going to surprise anybody. One thing that has annoyed me for years and continues, to be honest, to do so, is removing serviceable parts from aircraft. These are on condition and condition monitored components. To remove them to be recertified, and effectively for purely spurious reasons. In other words, people not accepting the records or not accepting the releases that the aircraft or the parts are initially put the aircraft on. And I would hope that sort of wasteful activity, will stop. Another thing that I think is also worth considering is that when things are good over the last decade, operators were maybe becoming increasingly picky about ensuring that newly leased but used aircraft, exactly match their fleet. And certainly us as a lessor spent an awful lot of money in ensuring and reconfiguring aircraft to ensure the commonality that the operators want was met. Now, look, I totally understand why the operators were asking for it, but in many cases, the balancing cost element of the reconfiguration and the amount of work we were doing was never fully considered. And a further flip side of that is to say that, except for what the passenger sees in an aircraft, why are there so many options available to operators in an aircraft? It's simply, ultimately, the aircraft is a tool. It has to be used, and yet, the amount of options that are available for individual operators and which individual operators demand, I still think is too much. An interesting statistic was when the MAX came into being, the number of options available had halved, and even that was probably still too much. Next slide. And one area here, and I don't think this has got much publicity, but I think there is definitely an enormous crisis within the industrial supply chain for aviation, and this is below the OEM level, and I think there's kind of been a double whammy there. There's less aircraft being produced and less business from that, but there's also been a real dry up of you know, reconfiguration and refresh programs. And so the demand within the supply chain of the tier ones and then further down from that has really been hit hard. And what I've seen already, and I've spent a lot of time talking to people who are leaving companies now, you know, it's not going to happen next year, it's already in full swing, is there's been a radical downsizing. And I think the loss of experience and talent, you know, it is enormous, and I think it's going to be very hard to replace in the future. And I know nobody here talks about there being, you know, a demand spike, but you know, I accept that the you know, demand will remain suppressed for a while, but there could be relative spikes within the overall depression. You know, if a virus, or sorry, a vaccine is announced at some point soon, there's an awful lot of people who would like to get back and travel and meet family and whatnot again. So, you know, I'm happy to accept that the, you know, IATA's predictions and whatnot, you know, I do see that, you know, when the tide turns, there could be localized surges in demand that will then become quite difficult for us, you know, MROs, suppliers, and ourselves as lessors to actually meet. Next slide. So look, you know, in summary, you know, totally agree, this is a crisis like we've never seen before. You know, happy to accept that the multi-year recovery that we're gonna have to see. I would say that, you know, like every crisis is an opportunity, and we should use that opportunity to be as efficient as we possibly can. And I think the final point, which is interesting too, is that this crisis wasn't created by anyone within aviation, you know, and it's affecting effectively everyone within aviation. And I really think that, you know, we're in this together, and I think, you know, if it drives better cooperation between, you know, lessors and operators, and between the suppliers and ourselves, and creates a more efficient industry overall, you know, maybe some good will become of it. That's it, Chris. So thanks for that.
Thank you very much, Mark. Appreciated your participation today. Please stay on a few minutes at the end of the leasing segment. Please post your questions. If you have questions to our lessors, to the panelists at this point, please post them so we can get to them at the end of the presentations. So Richard Hoch from ELFC is up next, and he will be talking to us from his viewpoint as a large engine lessor. So Richard, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks to everybody for joining in today. It's a pleasure to be involved. Thank you for the opportunity. ELFC, very briefly, we're a specialist independent engine lessor. We support all major engine OEMs. We're based in Shannon, Ireland, and we've been in business for 30 years this year. So we've seen quite a few of the downturns in the past. None as big as this one, I will say. So if you could move to the next slide, please, Julie. What I'm going to focus is on the COVID impact on leasing, but particularly engine leasing. And what I'm going to offer you is a perspective, but nothing definitive. We have a range of outcomes here and timelines that are way too broad. So it's too early to reshape our business, even though we have identified some probables and some possibles. But why is that? Looking at this chart, which I've taken from IATA Economics, we see in the RPK stats, it shows about a 75% reduction in traffic in 2020. And it does show potentially a big recovery in 2021 to about 75% of 2019 levels. This, to me, suggests there's a vaccine and the solution to this problem, and a general return to normal with a stronger than baseline recovery thereafter. Now, I'm not an economist, but I would question the higher than pre-COVID baseline growth at a time when an economic crisis is going to become the focal point, and a global one at that. Large multinationals, small businesses, personal balance sheets have all been impacted by this. Many of them have been shattered, and they don't realize it yet. And I think the impact on that is going to be on discretionary spending. Weekend breaks, visiting friends and relatives. I think the amount of travel people will do will be reduced. I think you'll largely find people will, to the extent they can afford it, will take their annual holiday, vacation. They could do with the headspace and the break. But I think the spur of the moment discretionary travel will be curtailed for a period of time. It was touched on earlier in Adam's presentation, but I also think business travel will be affected for a number of years. Combination of employer duty of care, as Adam has mentioned, but also, we've tested very much communications technology, and it works. We're on this today, a couple of hundred people logging into this webinar, and you're also going to see budget limitations from businesses who have to cut back on business travel and be able to do it quicker and maybe cheaper, although not the optimal way of meeting face-to-face with customers. So I think that will sustain itself for a while. Another consideration of this is, could disruption caused by COVID stay for a long enough period of time that are permanent changes to normal practices? We certainly don't know that, and it would be a period of time before we knew. So I think the greater risk to this recovery is to the downside on that band, which is a very broad band. It's just a thought for now, and I'll get back to that. Can I have the next slide, please? So what are we doing in ELSC currently to manage our way through this process? Well, I'm an engineer, and my primary function is to manage assets. Payment plans, the first one that comes up there, is something we've had discussion with every single customer. And we're like every other lessor out there. We're like every other lender out there, and most people that do business with each other. Everybody is looking for forbearance and payments because cash is not rotating through businesses. So asset inventory has increased. There's nothing surprising about that. There's been very little demand for leases in the last 6 months. And we foresee a softness in this demand until, I would say, the majority of aircraft start flying again and flying with a high rate of utilization. What we're doing to manage that is we're looking to take back assets in run-out condition where it's appropriate. And we're trying to match the fleet reduction and the demand for the overall aircraft fleet reduction, and therefore the impact and demand on us on the engines. And I'll get to that in a moment in another slide. We're also dealing with a number of operators and customers, some of them very long-term, who have gone bankrupt or filed for bankruptcy protection already. So we have to manage that in an environment of COVID restrictions, travel and inspectors, trying to manage logistics of transportation. We've seen that cargo has done pretty well, but there's also a reduction in capacity there because a large amount of cargo before COVID has traveled in the belly of passenger aircraft. So it's hard to get space on transport aircraft, and it's very expensive. We also have to manage the storage and preservation of an increasing number of assets, and all lessors are dealing with the same thing at the same time. From a remarketing and a new business side, what we're doing is preparing. It hasn't happened yet. We're preparing for the pickup, however and whenever it comes. We don't know exactly when that's going to be, and we don't know how quick it's going to be. We don't know whether it's going to come back briefly and double down again. We're very uncertain about this. None of us have seen this before, certainly not on anything on a scale like this. Can I have the next slide, please? So my comment here is there's no precedent for what's happening now. We've had a sudden and massive drop. It's been a shock, and I think we're all in the mode of shock treatment and shock management. The recovery, as you'll see through this slide, has plateaued to an extent. And I think it looks like it'll stay that way with maybe a small bit of up and down until we have a virus solution by way of vaccine. Some longer term thinking has started to reach the headlines in the publications, and the news isn't getting any more positive. I can move to the next slide. One metric here that I pick out from, and these are just a number of headlines in the last couple of days. The TSA passenger numbers, which I was crunching myself. They got a bounce after the 4th of July holiday, and they tapered back. They've done the exact same after the Labor Day holiday, where it got down to about 63% below 2019 numbers, and it's gone back up to or hover around about 70% again. So, can I have the next slide, please? So what we're seeing is a long-term impact on balance sheets of all participants in the industry. Airlines are certainly most affected. We're also seeing OEMs, lessors, part suppliers, etc., all being impacted. From a lessor perspective, we'll be ready for airlines seeking to generate and preserve cash. We've developed our lines of funding. Fortunately for ELSC, most of our funding is internally sourced from our parent, and we have it ready to work with airlines when they want to do refinancing or financing of new placement opportunities. In time, though not yet, there'll be leasing opportunities. there'll be some initial demand for leasing to burn green time and keep the aircraft flying from airlines from their own resources. As they park a large number of aircraft, they'll take the initial spare engines from the ones that are parked to keep the ones that are flying. But I think that will soon turn to the lessors, and Adam touched on this, as they need to keep a lot of those parked aircraft ready for an uptick. And also a number of those aircraft are owned by aircraft lessors who would not want to have their serviceable engines taken off to be operated on another aircraft, and therefore they're non-portable assets. So we do think that there will be opportunities soonest coming in the green time leasing space. From an asset management point of view, we're also processing certain parked out engines. It was a lesson for ELF in the last financial crisis of 2008 onwards that we needed to remove our exposure to the wholesale parked out engine market. It gives us greater ability to manage that exposure. We'll shelve some engines if necessary for a couple of years until that material is demanded. That does lead to where the demand is going to come from at the engine MROs. And I think that's going to come sometime after the green time demand for engines. Just a little formula at the bottom is basically just to highlight something here. The reduction in demand is relative to the rate of recovery. It always lags. Demand for us in spare engines is a function of the fleet size, utilization, the interval, turnaround time of the shop visit, and the confidence factor someone has in having a spare engine. The two biggest ones are highlighted there, the fleet and the utilization. They are most impacted by the current uncertainty in the market. If I can move to the next slide, please. So to get fleets and utilization numbers back up, and how we're sort of driving on a road that's full of fog and we can't really see the pathway in front of us, certainly with any distance, is we need an industry recovery, obviously. Big risk about quarantines until we have an effective vaccine. How long to roll that out? We're hearing Q1 2021 to Q4 2021. There is a question mark over the long-term efficacy of the vaccine. Will we have to live with this virus? Will this virus mutate and there could be a COVID-21, there could be COVID-22? We don't really know yet. So then how will the economy cover, given the carnage that's left behind? What we know is that not all customers survive. No uncertainty over who that will be, and that predominantly focuses on airlines, but a lot of the support companies, lessors, not all will come through it. Manufacturers will have trouble. Parts providers in the industry, not all of them will get through. On a more micro level from us and the ELFC, whatever fleet retirements there will be, they'll impact on the spare engine demand and residual values. Every aircraft that goes out of service and gets retired particularly early is one aircraft less to support and two more spare engines to support the remaining fleet. So we don't know where that's going to go, so there's a lot of uncertainty. Also, the OEM engine business model relies on the aftermarket. So how are they going to react? They don't make money from used serviceable material. They want to sell new material. There's the potential to offer incentives, which will have a longer term impact on residual values and part-out values. This, I only mention this because it highlights their level of control as being the only parties who manufacture replacement material, and they set the pricing for that. Just a consideration. Next slide, please. The longer term, and I put the question mark out as whatever that is, we're not quite sure. What I can say is that long-term players who have managed their way through cycles before will survive, as long as they're prudent and rational and are consistent in their approach. The main focus for asset investment will remain on narrow-bodied aircraft and narrow-bodied engines support them. The market cycle changes, which is the first and second bullet point under that heading there, they're part of a normal cycle. Reduction in the participants, some people will leave. And when the next upturn comes, some people will come back in. There'll be more modest production rates from airline manufacturers. That's just supply and demand. I do think the third and fourth points are more particular to this one. This downturn and the sudden drop of the credit rating of very solid airlines into bankruptcy protection and close to it, and potentially worse, will increase the focus on security packages for anybody. Primarily because the maintenance element is the biggest exposure. About 2/3 of an engine's value is tied up in this maintenance and LLP typically, and that can be liquidated over a couple of years. So there needs to be security. I do think power by the hour leases will stay for a while until airlines can at least see their way through this. The longer term changes in practices will be, I think a reduction in speculative orders from the aircraft lessors, certainly from engine lessors. It'll be more market reactive and refinancing. I think the business model of selling cheap on engines and making money on power by the hour services and selling material, I don't think it works with something like COVID. I don't think that model ever considered such a drop in fleet utilization. I don't think any of us really did, to be honest. But it'll eventually impact on pricing of parts and the model that goes with that. I think the industry will adapt. And I think the last 2 points there, to make itself future-proof for future epidemics, I think you'll see an impact on aircraft and airport layouts. Don't think it's directly going to impact on engines, but I think down the line it could do so. That's pretty much my points to make on this. For any discussion or questions, back to you, Chris.
Thank you so much, Richard, for all your support of the MCC over the years. And without wasting any moment, we'll turn over to Timur Kalimat from Jazz Aviation. Thanks again, Timur, for being with us, and we're going to hear your perspective as an airline also that flies a particular type of aircraft. So all yours, Timur. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Chris. First of all, good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everybody. I would say if this conference is 6 months ago, I would be presenting in front of you somewhere in the world. But today things are different, and I would like first to thank IATA in creating these webinars and these series, as well as for everybody to join remotely. Similar to the change that this MCC had, I want to share with you 2 different aircraft transactions that we had to challenge and we had to tackle differently in the past 6 months. Please, Geraldine, can you move to the next slide? Before I start, basically, I will spend a few minutes just to highlight with you. I'm sure you know what do we mean by aircraft transactions. Aircraft transactions can be broken down to basically to 2 different main streams. Introduction, based on a need to introduce aircraft or the aircraft to be phased out. Aircraft coming in and either basically can be either new or it can be used, and in both situations they can be either purchased or it can be leased. For the aircraft going out, you can sell them or you can return them to their owner, to the lessor, and these aircraft either they can be parted out or they can find a new home. So challenging any aircraft transaction, and within the mix of all those, we just need to make sure, Geraldine, can we go next? We just need to make sure that all airworthiness aspects are met, as well as we didn't do anything to harm the aircraft value. Also, as any other project, we have timelines to meet, as well as budget and limited resources to address and to take care into consideration. Can we go next, Geraldine? You can see from the upper chart to the right, basically, one of the most complex introduction transaction, and the lower highlight, basically, it's a phase out type. But also, as you can see between the orange and the gold, that what can be considered a complicated phased out project to some, it is an introduction to another. Geraldine, can we go next? Any aircraft transaction basically will require the receiving team to perform certain inspections. And these inspections can be broken down to the inspection to the physicality of the aircraft itself, and other stream will be basically an inspection to its records. From the graph, and depending on the aircraft transaction and type, the weight of these inspection shifts. You can see there is more weight to the physical inspection introducing new aircraft, and there will be more weight to the aircraft documents audit and transfer in the case of basically a phase out a used aircraft. Geraldine, can we move next? All right. So let's look into introducing a new aircraft and to what kind of physical inspection we are talking about. I broke down these physical inspection to few categories, main categories. I would say traditionally, the operator or the lessor will start these inspections 6 months before the delivery. They start with a BFE main component by final article inspection or on dock dates. Then during the production of the aircraft, they will have several stages where the owner or the operator will have to inspect and look into what assets they are getting into buying or leasing. And just before the delivery, basically the teams, we will be performing comprehensive inspections on site pretty much for a week, and then the aircraft will happen. That's traditionally. What we had in the past 6 months, and this is where we had to think differently, is unfortunately the main BFE items were inspected before the COVID situation. We were, and at that time, we were still in the middle of the production phases. We still have many aircraft to go yet. And so we had to evaluate what options do we have. And we were looking into the hiring local contractors to perform these inspections on our behalf. But at the end, we decided, and working with the manufacturer and our partner, basically, we decided to rely on the quality inspection and the use of the technology to provide visual aid. As just Mark mentioned, basically, GCAS, they were using drones and pictures and stuff. So and to capitalize on what Adam just mentioned, that in hard times, we rely on our ingenuity and how to do things differently. So we managed to do that for the production phases, but we elected for the last week of delivery to send our technical team and our pilots and to be on site. So basically, it was a hybrid solution in between what traditionally has been done and what we were forced to do. We still believe that there is a room to improve and to deploy and the use of technology for more, and we will have in the future maybe less reliance on on-site representation. Yeah, Geraldine, yes, perfect. So now this is on introducing a new aircraft, but now let's talk about phasing out the aircraft. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, the record audit and the transfer of this technical documentation take the majority of the effort. And typically, the parties basically will spend between 4 to 6 weeks on site dealing and transferring hard copies of papers and aircraft histories and stuff. So, Geraldine, can we go next? So in our case, basically, we had to return several aircraft to be parted out, and that by itself reduced the weight of the physical inspection to the asset and add more weight to the aircraft audit and records. So what we managed to do is similar to what Mark just mentioned from GCAS, is we managed all the communication remotely. We had all the meetings using web-based platforms, WebEx, Teams, and such a platform that we're using today. And we managed to transfer all the records electronically. So we didn't have to transfer any hard copy, and we managed to transfer electronic, basically, complete aircraft electronically. Can we go next, Geraldine? All right, so basically, as an outcome, and what we have managed to achieve is in these difficult times, making sure that we will have a complete airworthiness file and compliance, and we had no negative impact on aircraft value and the asset value. We have achieved timelines, and somebody would say what times we're talking about, where basically everybody is storing aircraft and there is not much of a need for an airplane. That's true, but thinking about aircraft production and the manufacturers, they had certain commitment for aircraft to be moved out, and we need to think about working with them. And at the same time, in this difficult times, we had very limited resources and very tough timelines, so many aircraft transactions. So we had to meet the timelines to assign the resources to the next aircraft, and in terms of phased out or a delivery. And of course, we managed to reduce the cost and to work with the limited resources. So what I encourage to go forward, similar basically message to what Mark just mentioned now, is to invest more on the use of new technologies for the physical inspection, and to continue to double the effort on the electronic record global acceptance, because currently maybe in North America and in Europe or in some certain areas in the world, electronic copies are accepted, but in some areas is not. So we would need to enhance that global acceptance. IATA is working and is doing some task force in this regard, and also to spread the awareness of what we can do better. I don't want to say that we want to standardize aspect or transactions or element in aircraft deliveries and in return, but we call them now best practices. So IATA has produced the leasing guidelines, as well as some guidance on LLP limitations or traceabilities, as well as also Mark mentioned, and Rich basically had a big footprint into the creation of the non-clearance statement that is being globally accepted now. So this is what I have, Chris, and this is my message to everybody.
Thank you very much, Timur. And we'll open up. We have a number of questions coming up from the audience. So the first one is for Mark, Mark Lynch from GCAS. And the question is, what are GCAS estimates for narrow body retirements in 2021 and 2022? What is in their estimates? I mean, just roughly, how do you see the market developing with respect to green time engines that will be entering the market with those retirements? Do you have any thoughts or how this will shape with respect to narrow bodies the upcoming years?
Frankly, I don't. I think it'll be a wait and see. We'll have to see what aircraft it is more valuable for us to retire by taking the parts out of the aircraft and getting value from that, versus the aircraft being leased on further. Like I think we have seen a slight reduction in the average life of a narrow body, and I guess the question will be, will that then translate into a further reduction from the COVID experience? So look, I honestly don't have any figures for you, and the impact on the engine side, I think Richard would probably know better than that, but it will simply be literally an airframe by airframe decision by each lessor on what's the best economic value in respect to that individual airframe over what they do next with it. And there could be a value in storing an aircraft for a period of time as well. Like, you can store an aircraft long term, it's been done before, and then when the recovery comes around, put the aircraft back in the market again. So like there's lots of options open to us.
Thanks, Mark. Richard, you want to add anything to this with respect to narrow body engines, green time?
Narrow body engines, there's going to be a lot of them there to support the market coming back, because at best there's going to be 70% capacity demand for the next year, 2 years, maybe a bit further beyond that. As Mark touched on, some of those aircraft will be parked and mothballed and kept ready. I don't think the engines will come off those to support the market because they want to keep those aircraft ready. There will be a lot of engines that come out of aircraft that are parted out early. I don't know exactly what the calculations are that the aircraft lessors or even the airlines put into exiting a fleet and deciding to part it out from an aircraft perspective. But I certainly think they'll look at cherry picking, first of all, the ones that are they're in the best commercial position to do so, that are approaching some very heavy maintenance either on the aircraft or the engine. And the aircraft lessors, I know some of them, what they do is, for their off-lease assets, they'll move engines around their own fleet of aircraft to ready some of them for remarketing and to prepare more of them for either a short-term aircraft lease, if you can manage that, or else you part out that airframe with those old engines.
Thank you, guys. Timur, from your side on the regional markets, did you get any lighter impact in your business as the regional aircraft flies more close distances in proximities? Have you been impacted with this? Did you have to defer some of your orders, or were there any changes from that perspective?
So, Chris, as everybody knows, and we just talked about it, that it's a very difficult time for the airline industry on all. And I would say maybe the regional market was not affected as a mainline, but it's still dramatically has been affected, and most of the regional airline aircraft they've been also in storage, or they were like the airline, they were evaluating options what to do with them. And we just know, we just heard now, Adam, and basically it's somehow quite optimistic that the demand will be coming, and but it's not going to be as was pre-COVID-19, and I believe that that will put some pressure on many to basically part out the airplane and start utilizing the assets, and having engines, as just Raj mentioned about the narrow body. I expect the same to be on a regional airplane, that the market will have many of those, and everybody will be seeking to burn green times on them rather than doing maintenance and stuff.
Thank you, Timur. A very practical question for Mark, and it may apply to the others. With regards to the acceptance of electronic records during COVID crisis and the transactions and so far, are the original records still kept and sent back to GCAS, or you destroy them? What do you do? I think this is a very practical question for you, Mark.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've been having that internally so often about who's going to say we're going to now burn all the records. and frankly, we haven't got to that point yet. But I honestly I think it's very close. I think there will be the stage where we literally won't keep. We'll just get rid of any paper records. Everything will be digitalized or kept electronically, and then the original paper copies will be destroyed. Because ultimately, if if you have a paper copy or a secure mechanism for scanning it and reprinting it, what's ultimately the difference? So yeah, I do see the paper records, being burnt.
Thanks, Mark. I believe from my end that we should not even produce paper records in the first place. Who avoid all this? Yeah, from the very beginning, from where it starts. A question for Richard. Richard, you mentioned that there will be more of a trend to power by the hour, PBH type agreements. But when the industry is so much down in utilization, how do you see that being impacting the industry? How do you see that there will be more PBH when the hours are not accumulating, so you will get your investment money back, let's say, from that perspective?
Yeah, well, it's not certain that you'll get your investment money back. I suppose managing a PBH, I should clarify, when I refer to the perseverance of PBH for the next couple of years, that is PBH of lessor aircraft and lessor spare engines, as distinct from a PBH from an engine OEM to maintain them on that basis. And that's really a function of airlines who are restructuring are going to give you back assets, either through bankruptcy protection, in which they can terminate the leases, or it's just a lease expiry. And even under both scenarios, you'll either take the engine back into inventory and add it to the other engines, or from an aircraft lessor's perspective, park it with the other aircraft you have in storage somewhere and wait for the market to turn, which is very uncertain. Or you could keep it with somebody who will maintain it, who will preserve it, who will operate it maybe infrequently, will pay you as you use it. And certainly, as airlines don't have, and I talk about this, the road we can't see in front of us yet, airlines cannot as yet have any visibility on how quick and how strong this recovery is going to be. So they're not going to commit to assets long term. And if anything, they'll shrink down to a level that they can maybe just about survive and say, if we need to find assets, we'll go and get them. So you're really dealing on those terms in the market. And PBH is basically a consequence of that. We don't like it, because there's no certainty of our revenue, but that's where we are in the downturn.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you so much. One other question is and I will address it to all of you if you would like to chip in. What do you see or what do you expect as the proportion of leased versus owned aircraft by the airlines? Do you see that there will be a structural change in the business model from the airline perspective? Will they look more to own, more to lease? Will that have an impact on their business in general? Anyone wants to comment on this? Mark, you have any comments? Have you thoughts?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, leased aircraft are 40% of the fleet now. They've been increasing, you know, gradually over the last 30 years. And I don't see that changing. I think the increase will continue. You know, you've seen certain lessors have been in the market already, you know, conducting purchase leasebacks or sale leasebacks from the airline's perspective. And, you know, ultimately it will be decisions by the airlines to say whether they want to be in the aircraft owning business and whether they want us to take residual value risks of the asset, or whether they see themselves as an operator of an asset and that the aircraft or the engine is simply a tool that they lease, the same as they lease their you know, their office furniture. So, you know, and I think that will ultimately come down to decisions, you know, made by the airline. I think there was talk that 40% was kind of the natural position for lessors to be in, 40% ownership of the fleet, but I'm not sure if that's true now.
Richard or Timur, anything to add? Or
so basically, I would say, you know, traditionally the need to lease airplane was driven by a fact that airlines, they wanted to have that flexibility to face the industrial downturn, and now we are in a downturn. So and for the past few years, when basically the industry was booming and rocketing up in the skies, we have, and fuel prices were down, we have seen also the appetite for the airline to go and buy airplanes because the access to capital was really attractive and interest rates were low. So and airlines basically, they had lots of cash. So it's a very complicated answer, Chris, what's going to happen in the future, because what happened, you know, for the past few years, there were like no trend to see to highlight what a best portfolio between owned or leased aircraft for an airline will have, and especially now with the downturn, it's I think we need to look into other factors, and the market and the capital market will be a decisive factor in this, and the availability for funds.
okay, I think we are
just to add on that, I actually think there'll be a bit of a divergence between aircraft and engine leasing. I think historically, since the 80s, when aircraft leasing started and grew, engine leasing followed behind it. It was a smaller ticket item, but then people realized they are still very expensive. And engine leasing has always followed behind aircraft leasing a little bit. But whereas I think that 40% that Mark alludes to around about there is where the natural position of leasing would sit, and it may change in the future small, but I think engine leasing will drive on because airlines will look at the flexibility and the ability to turn back an engine at relatively short notice compared to an aircraft. It's a much simpler process. You have to get a certain number of records in place, you have to do some servicing, and you have to do boroscope and maybe a test run, and that's it. You can give an engine back within a couple of weeks, assuming that's the end of your lease period and you don't want to extend. It's a much more difficult and protracted arrangement to return an aircraft, and that's why I think engine leasing may actually come out of this in the long run as a stronger product.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you, for being here today with us, and appreciate your time. And with this, we move on to our next presenter, who is Martin Harrison from ICF, and he will be talking to us about their forecast about the global MRO market. Martin, thanks for your support of the MCC over time, and the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks, Chris, and thanks to my fellow panelists. It's great to listen to you, and thanks to the people listening. And we can actually see the number of attendees. And what's one benefit for us presenters of a webinar versus being at a conference is, at a conference by now, half the people would have gone to the bar, particularly in the maintenance conference. So it's really great. I think there's more people now than at the start of the conference. So thank you for staying. Sonny is speaking after me from Delta Tech Ops. He's brilliant, so please stay to the end as well. So Geraldine, next slide. We're going to talk to you about our views on the forecasting and much more focus on MRO. For those of you who don't know ICF, we're a consultancy. We've been around for a long time. We do a lot of forecasting, not just for MRO, but our teams do this for airports, for private equity, for governments, for airlines. So it's very much an art and a science that our experts live and breathe every day, basically. And obviously, they've been quite perplexed to figure out what it means to the updating of the forecasts that we've done. So next slide, Geraldine. So there's kind of two halves to this. It's a short presentation. The first one is to take very much the passenger outlook that many people referred to already and start to think about that from the perspectives of fleets and sub-fleets and what that means to the outlook for individual fleets. And then obviously that feeds the critical essence of the MRO in terms of what that means for MRO and the outlooks. So that's the basic agenda. Next slide, Geraldine. So yeah, if you look at the left-hand side of the slide, you know, we, like many forecasters, have published our view on when we believe we'll be back to pre-COVID levels, and they're all relatively similar, and some are more prudent in terms of the time it takes, but there is this kind of common, almost blind belief that, yeah, we're all going to get back and it's just a question of time. And so all of the graphs like we've got there, the numbers represent what percentage of pre-COVID, and what we mean by pre-COVID is 2019. And yes, it differs by region, yes, it differs by type of market, but basically, you know, there's this view that, you know, come 2023, for example, we will be back. Good news. But I on the right-hand side of the chart there, I've included, a bit like Richard did, you know, I've used Brian's chart from earlier in the week on MCC #1, because I think this is a real sort of cause to stop and think about when we say, yes, we'll be back in 2 to 3 years, because we won't. I mean, it depends on what you mean we'll be back 2 to 3 years, because, and I think Adam picked it up right at the end of his sentence when he looked at this as well, there's a gap. We will never be back to where we should have been without COVID. We'll be back to 2019, yes, but we'll be never back to where in 2019 we felt we should have been. Never. That's what that graph's showing. The gap is never closed. And therefore, all of our business cases that look forward and said, you know, my investment is going to bring this because of this volume in the future, you know, my share price, everything that's based upon future-looking assumptions has had a structural change. We will never return to 2019 forecast levels is more accurate statement, and we're just going to be back to 2019 pre-COVID levels. So to me, that was a very valuable slide that Brian put up there. So of course the question is, so there is a structural reset, that seems to be a relatively consistent view. What is it that structurally changed? You know, which bits of change that I need to be aware of, and how does that impact my business? I think that's really the question for people to ask. So if you go on to the next slide, this is a kind of a layman's guide to fleet forecasting, and fleet forecasting, it's not like this light comes on above my head and it's 62.7%. It's obviously formulas and assumptions, and that drives from the passenger count to get ultimately to a fleet mix, which gets to the MRO, which is the second part of this. And a number of important assumptions are potentially going to change that drive the number of aircraft, the type of aircraft, and how much those aircraft are operating. And it's worth thinking about some of the ones that are not necessarily directly maintenance or aircraft, but do impact that load factor is an important consideration if you're saying how many of these passengers drive that many aircraft. And we're certainly seeing massive drop-offs in load factors. All of the revenue management curves are out of the window, no shows. Everything is really messed up at the moment, probably will be for some time. So load factors are lower than historical records, obviously, and probably going to stay lower for at least a bit until the commercial teams get their head around how to manage the new supply and demand. Everything's much later in booking and more volatile. And equally, utilization is dropping because turnaround times are getting longer because of the new cleaning regimes, and the utilization flying, as it used to be called, which is putting flying in just to get block hours up, is less likely to happen because there's simply not enough need for that. So the utilization will come down, and the combination of those two alone, very important levers in determining how many aircraft you need, because and it's going to drive the fleet up. In if you think about it, less utilization and lower load factor means more fleet for the same number of passengers. So those are important assumptions to think about. But more importantly, I think for this audience is also what people have spoken about before, which is the fleet mix, and ultimately less aircraft. And the key question is, so which ones are not going to be there? So which ones are going to be retired early, parked for extended periods, or retired and broken down? Which new deliveries may not come, maybe deferred, maybe cancelled. More likely deferred at the moment, less cancellations, but certainly a bunch of deferrals. So those are really the important questions that forecasters and businesses are asking themselves. With this structural reset, albeit it's going to come back to a degree, which elements are going to be most effective. So in the next couple of slides, I'll try and give some views on that. So if we go on to the next slide, Geraldine. So we've tried to get some initial data of what airlines are doing for their decision making, of which aircraft types they fly and which aircraft types they're parking and not using. So this data, these graphs, are actual flying data from Flight Radar 24 information. So they're not published and maybe cancelled. These are proper actual flights. And the basically way to read it is the bigger the red, the more the flights have decreased. So if it's at the top on the right, wide body, the 380s, at the start of the reduced flying, their flying rate went down by 90-odd%, basically completely stopped. The smaller, newer aircraft were the ones that airlines chose to operate. That's a leading indicator. The other leading indicator, 4 engines really not being used. And we feel that obviously things will change a bit, but that evidence, that leading indicator has been backed up by evidence of statements about we're going to send these to the desert, the 380s, 747s, with the exception of some cargo moves, they're going to go. Older, twin engine wide body, probably the ones that are not being used, and so that's, we feel, kind of a leading indicator that in many respects are going to stick. 4 engines, older, and maybe the smaller ones are more favoured. 321 might be an interesting exception to that, because we do see the 321 XLR being an interesting, potentially more interesting option to replace some wide body flying as the markets, particularly on the thinner routes, are not so valuable. So I think those are the types of information thinking that we've been doing to say what does that mean in terms of the potential parking, retirements, and which ones might be deferred or not on deliveries. And that's next slide. And so that's really the fleet side of it. Trying to say, obviously the fleet dictates the maintenance and utilization. That fleet dictates the maintenance as well, because it's obviously largely flight hour driven in many cases. Next slide. Let's go. So many of you will have seen our forecast before. Normally we take a dozen slides to get to here. We look at it in various different cuts, but this is a base case example to say what do we think 2024 looks like versus 2019, and even though on a passenger perspective, if you remember, we believe that the number of passengers will be the same or more, the maintenance spend will be less. So if you're on this call and you're a seller of maintenance, your market is shrinking. If you are a buyer of maintenance, then your budget is going to get slightly better, just simply because of structural changes. And so I tried to sort of rationalize, well, why is it shrinking? What are the main structural changes? that would drive that. So newer planes, obviously newer planes need less maintenance, particularly if they've got less engines, but nonetheless need less maintenance because the C checks are smaller, the time between C check is longer. So basically, newer planes, less maintenance. Engines is an interesting one, and it'd be interesting to hear Sonny talk about that next, and Richard spoke about it a bit. There is a view from some commentators that there will be a dramatic change in engine maintenance shop visits because you've got a lot of parked aircraft. Great, we just take the engines off and avoid putting anything in the shop. Brilliant. But we go into a more granular view on that, and we say, well, not in all cases at all. No, it really very much depends, and it depends on things like if you have a power by the hour, where it's like a classic PBH where you prepay, you've paid all the money out. Why would you not put the engine in the shop and get it back fully refurbished and take all of the newness and fuel burn benefits that come from a fresh engine, rather than taking another worn out engine off another aircraft and running that? Equally, if you prepaid maintenance reserves, it's like, well, it's interesting, Mark's face. If I were to come to you and say, look, instead of taking the reserves and putting them to put the engine in the shop, I'm going to take one of my other engines off, but please give me the cash, and I promise I will do the maintenance later. Might not want to do that because there's obviously securitization against that particular asset. And equally, if there's ABS on certain aircraft, and are they going to want to start taking engines off and giving them to subleasing them to different airlines? I'm really not so sure. So I think, our view is that yes, there will be a reduction, but I think that many commentators are perhaps overstating that when you start to think about the contractual commitments and what that means. Similar thing with heavy maintenance, D checks. There's a view that, yeah, you don't need to do the D checks, just park them up when they come due. And yeah, to a degree, certainly we've been involved in certain bankruptcies, and that's been a consideration which aircraft you keep or give back, because the cash of a D check, particularly if the reserves are gone, is an awful lot more than any rental consideration. So yeah, probably some impact on D checks, certainly in the short term. And components, again, it will be interesting to look at the next, when the series about used serviceable parts, because again, there's a view that, oh yeah, that will squash the component repair and overhaul spend. But again, it depends on the PBH. It depends on really whether it's still going to be cheaper to buy one versus repair it, or so again, maybe a bit too much froth in that view as to how much it's going to dramatically reduce spend. What we are seeing, nonetheless, sort of separate to that, is airlines are renegotiating with their, in liquidator or in administration or not, they are renegotiating, expecting reductions in flight hour rates, expecting removals of minimum guarantee levels and going more to PBH. Pure without PBH and only above a certain threshold. So I think there's definitely reductions in spend, and we see that here in our numbers, but it's perhaps not as dire as I think perhaps some other commentators have talked about. Next slide to make sure I keep on track. Some implications of that. Sometimes maintenance, a bit like pilot training, another example, can be seen as, well, it's regulatory, it's safety, nothing we can really do to contribute to additional cost saving. And I think that will constantly be challenged by the boards. It's difficult to keep doing that. It's difficult to lose, for example, headcount. It's kind of like losing the fat, and then you start cutting into the muscle, and then you start cutting into the bone. How much can you objectively do that when it's your baby that you're talking about, your organization? And then lastly, to keep being more efficient, there's a classic view of people, processes and tools. The people side of it, again, is quite difficult, not just in headcount, but the way we pay people. Maintenance is still very much a fixed cost. Pilots, flight attendants are much more variable pay per hour. So will that be something that gets challenged more in maintenance? The process is much more about change management. We all know how difficult that is, and systems, mobile and code to to make things more efficient. You know, those are the first things that are being cancelled in terms of spend. So the investment needed to be more efficient is one of the first things going. So, so that's, you know, those are tough views that I think are coming to us all in this MRO world. My last slide, I don't want to finish on a downer, because obviously you think, oh, thanks for that. That's cheered me up no end. Thanks, Harrison. Thanks for that. So I could talk about chocolate, but I refer to Mr. Warren here to say what does he tell us? You know, his wise words. And I think the opportunity, I think there's a real opportunity here for MROs, whether you're in the business or providing or could be, but I think there's going to be opportunities to buy good quality MRO provision providers, more consolidation, and those who are strong and well capitalized, you know, potentially have opportunities to grow your strengths and come out stronger at the end of this. So that's potentially a bit of upside for some of you. I don't know where I am with time. I hope I'm on track. That's it. Oh, thank you very much, everybody. And I'm going to hand to Sonny now to wrap up. Thank you.
Thank you, Martin. So, Sonny, your turn. And thanks for being a part of the MCC for a number of years now, and appreciate your time. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much for inviting me and Delta, Chris. We appreciate it. I don't think you can see me. My camera's not working. Is that correct, Geraldine?
Yeah, that's correct, Sonny. Yeah.
Okay. I'm so disappointed about that, because I was up at 4. I showered, I shaved, did my hair. I look so good. So sorry y'all can't see me. Anyhow, what we wanted to talk about were factors impacting the MRO market. So wanted to just briefly chat about 6 different topics. Fleet ramp up and variability, return of aircraft to lessors and revised lease structure, retirements and furloughs, supply chain support, parts availability, and green time engines. I think what you'll see, next slide please, Geraldine. I think what you'll see here is there's a lot of common themes with my fellow presenters. I think we're seeing the industry somewhat similar. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a spin on it as we see MRO as an airline MRO shop. You know, how much capacity do you bring on as an airline, and what fleets do you utilize? Previous presenters have talked about this quite extensively, so I won't go into great detail. And the challenges for the maintenance planning and the performance of the maintenance for that fleet ramp up. I think one of the things that we are seeing here at the airline is the network's constantly changing view of what the ramp up should look like, and what fleets should we bring on, and what regions of the world and the country are picking up, and how does that puzzle work. It's a quite complex puzzle, and it's discussed on a regular basis, and it really does affect maintenance and maintenance organizations, because we can't do all of that work. There's lots of aircraft that we've got that are out in storage facilities around the world, and so all of those facilities are affected by us making decisions to bring aircraft up or not, or put them back into storage. Next, the return of aircraft to lessors, the revised lease structure. This has been talked about previously as well, and lease fleets are being returned in favor of retaining owned assets. And the operators are definitely requesting leniency from the lessors. I think what we've seen here at Delta, and it's publicly known that we've done a lot of sale leasebacks, which does change that equation for us. So what would have previously been a fleet demographic is changing a bit because of the sale leasebacks and not owning those aircraft anymore. So it's a dynamic that's quite interesting to talk about with regard to maintenance. Next subject is the retirements, furloughs, and personnel changes. I think this affects we see this affecting the entire MRO industry. just at Delta alone in tech ops, we had voluntary retirements and voluntary leaves in about the 20% range, and we've gotten a lot of folks that said we were ready to retire after a nice aviation career of 30 or 40 years. So we are going to have less manpower to support the maintenance, and I think as a whole the industry is going to lose talent, and it's going to affect our ability and our competitors' abilities to work. But we're hoping that it scales with the fleet retirements and the fleet downsizing, so that it doesn't affect us so much as an organization. To date, predominantly the work that we've been doing, we've been very lucky in this environment, in that we deal with freight organizations. A good portion of our business is associated with the freight haulers. So we've not seen as much of a downturn as some have. And it's really affected us in the fact that our numbers are better than expected, even though we've had a 20% reduction in workforce. Next is supply chain support. Suppliers and aviation supply chain disruption. We've seen this in disruption in the engine environment with regard to suppliers of parts repairs, blades and vane repair shops. It's been affected by this, and it's been a challenge in some cases. Imports and exports stopped, production facilities shut down and or reducing their output. Review of contracts to determine where support is currently needed. This has been somewhat of a challenge to us. We're overcoming it, but it has actually increased some of our turnaround times. Next, parts availability. Are parts available to support our required shop visits? Airlines are taking the downtime to process part outs and make materials available. So as I said just a moment ago, the parts network and the repair network is a bit challenged, and sometimes those parts aren't available, and with the downturn, some have taken the liberty to start parting out, but really there's not as much material yet available. It's going to be interesting to see how that transpires. And then finally, green time engines. There's been a lot of discussion today on that, and we've got some opinions of that. I think when we were putting this presentation together, some of what we looked at was what we talked about 4 months ago and what green time would be available, and now evolving 4 months later to this third conference. I think that the market's a little bit different and the outlook's a little bit different in a positive way. It seemed a bit more dire 4 months ago, and now we don't think they're, and I'm speaking from a maintenance perspective, from an MRO perspective, don't think there's going to be quite as many green time engines that will displace shop visits, although we know that based upon what 2019's outlook for shop visits into 2020 was, just using the CFM fleet as an example, I want to say there was somewhere in the neighborhood of 2,500 shop visits planned worldwide, and then COVID hit and the fleet reduced, and we looked at 2020 and 2021 as that number being cut in half. And then some of the discussions that were had 4 months ago is that green time will supplement a very large portion of those required shop visits. I'm less likely to think that, based upon some of what all of my fellow presenters have said, and we believe that these lessors will most likely want their assets to remain whole, to hopefully lease them out when the need does come back. Next slide, Geraldine. So just to go into a little bit more detail of the fleet ramp up and variability, there's lots of factors that affect the ramp up. As I mentioned earlier, we've got aircraft around the world, and we're flying aircraft into countries all around the world, and it's been an interesting dynamic for us as an airline and for us to adapt as an MRO. The early retirements have been a challenge, and airlines, we feel, will be trying to sell what they own. for liquidity reasons, and it's an interesting challenge. The other is retirements and furloughs, less manpower, less shop availability. Some airline MROs are no longer supporting third-party work. It's quite interesting. I think there's a large airline MRO that was doing third-party maintenance and is no longer doing that third-party maintenance to the levels they were. I think it'll open opportunities for the ones that remain. And product line shifts, as was mentioned by a few earlier presenters. You know, some of the older metal is going away. As for an example, our MD-80 fleet, we did retire through this, which took out a lot of JT8 engines, and whom the producer or the MROs that produce those engines for us are no longer going to have that work. And that leads to the training of new employees, the younger, newer, the folks that stayed training in some of the newer technology, and even for that matter, some of the older technology. Next slide, please. And just one more slide on green time engines. With the retirement outlook decreasing to reflect recent and early retirements and leases not being extended, the question that we have is, will there be enough green time engines in the market? And if there's not enough green time engines in the market, the outlook we feel is that there'll be more shop visits performed, which will lead the engine MRO business to being maybe a little bit more healthy than some are feeling today. Combined with the desire to keep assets whole, like I had mentioned earlier, the airframe lessors, I've heard the common theme will want to keep those engines or aircraft whole and not separate the engines. And again, will lead to more shop visits, maybe a little bit more than Martin had shown in the slide earlier, where I think the engine maintenance portion of the maintenance spend was significantly lower, but we're hopefully remaining optimistic that that number will be maybe a little bit higher. Final slide. So Martin, you left on a high note, and I think this quote was one that we came up with that is nice. The Wright brothers created the single greatest cultural force since the invention of writing. The airplane became the first World Wide Web, bringing people, languages, ideas, and values together. There's huge value. We feel there's huge value in aviation. Yeah, it will shrink a little bit for the foreseeable future, but it, as Adam said, is still a viable entity, and still we strongly think that the market will come back. And that's all I've got.
Thank you, Sonny, very much for your presentation. So one question that always is part of the MCC is about the use of PMA parts. If you both want to comment on those, do you see any uptick on PMAs? Of course, we will have the fourth webinar coming up next Wednesday, but if you would like to comment if that will have an impact or it's a question of the past these days. Any thoughts? Maybe we'll start from you, Martin.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm just not sure. That's it. Well, I don't think it's that important. If the view is right, there's a lot of surplus material coming in. I don't think it's going to get any different, really, material. I think it's a question of the past, I would probably say. Yeah.
Sonny, any different view on your end?
I'd actually like to raise that question, divert the question to Mark and to Richard. I guess I have a personal belief that PMA will be more relevant in the future, in that if the teardowns don't occur to the levels that we might think they are today. And with the airline's economic depression, I happen to believe that there might be a stronger desire for airlines to use PMAs. And my belief is maybe for the lessors like the GCASs and the ELFCs of the world to maybe have a little bit more leniency in order to keep an aircraft at a lessee as opposed to them returning that. If there's as much available aircraft in the desert and an airline wants to keep that asset, if they're able to use PMA, will you, GCAS and ELFC, say, you know what, I'll have a different view because of that? I'd love to hear their view.
Mark, if you're still around, any thoughts on this, or Richard? Mark, let's go with you first.
Yeah, look, can you hear me there?
Yes, absolutely.
Look, I don't think our position has changed on PMA parts, with things, critical parts, landing gear, engines, that sort of stuff. We generally don't like it. Airframe parts, interior parts, whatever, we don't care. So look, that situation hasn't changed and probably won't change. I think the only exception probably is at the tail end of a final lease or something like that, where everyone is trying to get the remaining green life out of an asset. I think that becomes a slightly different question, but that's really the only kind of comment I'd make on that. Okay, Richard, any thoughts from your end?
Yeah, I'd agree with Mark that certainly in the short run, it's not going to change from a lessor's perspective, because the issue, certainly from an engine lessor's perspective, is all about remarketability, and we don't have an issue in placing an engine with an operator who has an OEM contract for maintenance if the engine doesn't have any PMA or DER in it. If it does, conversely, we do have a problem, and it's the way in which the OEMs have sought to protect the aftermarket, and I've been open with commenting about this over the years. It's clearly an OEM action to protect their position in the aftermarket, but I will balance that by saying it's somewhat understandable because they've invested a lot of money in those assets. But I think in the longer run, this could change, and it could change because I do think the OEMs have to look at their model of selling engines cheap, like razors, and selling razor blades afterwards to make money out of that. And if that model does change, then I do think in the long run it opens up the potential opportunity for people to then look at more competitive marketplace for aftermarket material and repairs.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. I think one question with respect to it's maybe for Sunny first, with airlines being on like a summer winter schedule, and if the vaccine gets out ultimately, we are afraid at IATA, and we have internal discussions, if because of the program and the schedule that starts on specific dates, and many of the shops have been with not that many people around to support them. Do you see that there will be a fight, let's say, of who gets a slot to do a C check or a D check first, because all these parked aircraft, they have deferred a lot of maintenance, and if they all come together because of the schedule, how is the MRO market? How are the MROs are going to react to this? And I will start with you, Sonny, as you are part of the MRO also market, if you have any thoughts on this.
Yeah, no, Chris, I think it's a very valid comment in that we, just as Delta, have, because of the retirements, the early retirements that I mentioned, we've got a smaller workforce. Therefore, we're able to do fewer engines and fewer component repairs, and we don't do too much airframe, but I think it transcends across the industry where similarly MROs have gotten rid of the workforce. It's never been a physical facility, a brick and mortar problem as we've seen it. It's more of a manpower situation, and at Delta, just purely in the engine shop, You can't just hire a mechanic and put him into an engine shop and put him on an engine line and have him be productive immediately. The challenge is always training those individuals. So even if it's an experienced engine mechanic, you can't just take them and put them from a Pratt engine to a GE engine and have instant productivity. There's probably a 6-month learning curve to get through. So it will, I believe, it will definitely affect the resurrection of fleets, especially if the network folks of airlines, are changing their decisions on a regular basis. It's a tough one for us to adapt to, just for the airline fleet, because a lot of these aircraft that have been in storage will need engine maintenance and airframe maintenance, and if you don't make a definitive plan today, it could affect you in 6 months. And if you change it 3 months in, will your partners, one, your shop that you, for us, a shop, and two, our partner MROs that do a lot of our airframe, will they be able to adapt to those changes? So it's definitely a complex equation that has volatility.
Okay, I think our time is coming up, so we don't have time for any other question or to elaborate further. It's a very complex question, but with this note, I would like first to wish Geraldine happy birthday. It's her birthday today, so happy birthday to her. And,
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you, Geraldine, for all your help. I think Geraldine will buy us chocolate next time we meet her.
I will.
And thank you very much to all of you who participated in this webinar today. And hopefully we'll see you next Wednesday again, when we have our last, our final episodes in the MCC series. And we will talk about the role of used serviceable material. We have a lineup of very well-known speakers in the area. So we wish you happy remaining of the day today, and all the best to all of you. And thanks again for your participation. And then to all you attendees, thank you very much for staying with us and supporting us. Have a nice day. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Happy birthday, Geraldine.